How did an immigrant from Iceland in his 40s become a single father of 4 during the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression and thrive? My name is David, a descendant of many immigrants to America. For this photo narrative tracing my immigrant roots, I will focus on the lives of my great-grandparents on my mother's side, the Magdals. The Magdals' lives paint a picture of how circumstances like disease and pandemics impacted families nearly a century ago. As their 21st century descendant, living through COVID-19 in our own time reminds me how deeply vulnerable human beings are to sickness and other life-changing events. Even today, immigrants face more exposure to pandemics than anyone. It's amazing how much our lives and paths can be shaped by uncontrollable events and tragedies. Their experiences in a different time, including their hardships, put my own existence into context. They crossed oceans and borders, faced difficulty, and persevered, leaving behind a legacy I can now exist to retell. My great-grandfather, Paul Magdal, was born in 1878 and lived in Iceland until he was nearly 40 years old. Supporting his family in the city of Reykjavik, he worked as a carpenter by trade. We still have his saw with his initials carved into it. This piece of history is special to me because you can hold on to something of his work. The family retells how, in America, Paul regularly bicycled around northeast Minneapolis with a toolbox, doing local carpentry work. So how did he get to Minnesota? In Reykjavik, Iceland, Paul had a wife, children, a new baby, an established life. In 1918, however, a major pandemic swept the globe and changed everything when his wife and new baby were killed by the 1918 flu. Paul left his remaining children behind in Iceland, possibly in the care of his mother Groa, and arrived in Quebec, Canada by ship. He intended to bring the rest of his family over, but was never able to do so. Paul lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba for his first years in America. The house he rented still stands today. In Winnipeg, he met and married his second wife, the kind and beautiful Ranka Johansson, the daughter of 2 Icelandic immigrants from South Dakota, Johannes and Gudrun. Ranka walked with a limp due to contracting polio at a young age. Paul and Ranka married on September 23rd of 1922 and had their first baby together, Joe. Less than a year later, in August of 1923, they snuck Joe across the border into the United States through North Dakota and settled in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As Northeast Minneapolis was a largely Polish immigrant community at the time, they had to learn both English and Polish to get by. Here, they built a new life together and had 3 more children, one of them my grandmother Trudy. The family was financially poor, which meant moving a lot. We can trace at least 7 places they lived in Northeast Minneapolis, so I went on a tour collecting pictures. Many of the houses and fourplexes they rented are still standing. Paul and the children were poor, but people looked out for the kids. They wore relief clothing with tags on the inside that said, "Not for sale, relief clothing." They really hated their clothes. A family member wrote an account saying, "Joe said that he and his brother and sisters were playing outside this church one day and heard organ music playing. This sound led them to peer into the church. This connection led them to meet Mrs. N.P. Eklund of Eklund Clothing Company, who watched out for the Magdal children and bought them clothes and gave them nice things. As they built a life from the ground up, poor but getting by with the help of the community, the tragedies of the era would again hit our family. A good friend of Ranka's came down with tuberculosis. which typically meant people left home to be cared for in large state-run facilities called sanatoriums. Described as a gentle and loving person, in an act of supreme kindness, Ranka agreed to care for her friend's baby. Unknown to Ranka, the baby also had contracted tuberculosis. Ranka caught the horrible disease and had to be transported by carriage and train to the Glen Lake Sanatorium in what is now Minnetonka, Minnesota. Ranka spent the rest of her life in this facility, only occasionally able to visit home. Here they had medical care, special spit sinks for blood, sunbathing therapy called heliotherapy, a library, and communal dining. Built in 1916, the sanatorium started small and expanded for decades, peaking at a population of 700 patients. It was the first sanatorium in the country to be accredited by the American Medical Association. It was here Ranka spent her later days and came home briefly, where she died on June 5th of 1935. She was 47 years old. Her absence and death left Paul to raise 4 children as a single working father. This could not have been easy for him, but he did it. Paul and Ranka's children and their descendants are my family, a strong, vibrant family in the tradition of the kind people who raised them. Paul eventually became a naturalized citizen in 1942. Nobody ever questioned his son Joe's citizenship status. After Ranka's death, Paul was part of his family's life for decades to come. He lived another 22 years and died at the age of 79. Ranka and Paul rest in waving distance of each other at the Crystal Lake Cemetery in North Minneapolis. I am an American, a U.S. citizen, because of the experiences and bravery of Ranka and Paul. Their experiences, much like the experiences of immigrant families today, were difficult. They faced a lot of hardship and death. They lived in poverty, working hard to support their family, and like many immigrants today, their community uplifted them, making it possible for them to advance, survive, and for their children to have clothes. Their experiences remind me that while I have great privilege in the United States as a light-skinned male who speaks English and has an education, my roots are from people who came to America like anyone else today. My roots are people who struggled with poverty and survived. My roots are people who dealt with death and disease and thrived. My roots are people who snuck a baby across the border and built a new life. Knowing this, I can never make an other out of anyone coming to America with their children, building a better life, because this is my family's story too. I wouldn't judge them anyway. I can never judge anyone who comes here and works to feed and clothe their children, but needs help to do so. This is my family's story too. The photos I chose show the real people behind the story and what they went through. This narrative impacts me because it's a reminder that I'm not so different from the people who are newly arriving and learning English. I am not so different from people from other places lifting themselves from difficult circumstances, who are building a new life. My name is David Coleman, a 4th-generation American, a descendant of immigrants.